What a celebration. Christmas can be a lot of fun. But can we be honest for a second and admit that it's also a bit odd? I mean, it just seems like we're making an awfully big deal about a baby. Because when you look past all of the tinsel and traditions, Christmas is just a birthday party for baby Jesus. Now, granted, it's a weird birthday party. Instead of cake, we serve gingerbread. Instead of flowers, we buy entire trees. Instead of rewatching old movies from the person's past, we rewatch old movies about radioactive reindeer and crime scene Christmas parties and socially awkward elves. And maybe weirdest of all, instead of buying gifts for the birthday boy, we buy gifts for everyone but the birthday boy. I wonder how Jesus feels about that. How would you feel about that at your birthday? Weird, right? We may be called Grinches if we question Christmas, but for many years after becoming a Christian, I was confused by Christmas. Now, Easter, I understand. That was the day Jesus rose from the grave to defeat death and sin forever. That is a big deal. The miracles and the Sermon on the Mount, amazing. But none of that happened until 3 decades after this silent night we're celebrating. Jesus was just an infant, so he probably didn't do much that first Christmas, other than cry and eat and poop. You can imagine Mary looking over to Joseph as something seemed to be happening in Jesus' shorts and asking, "Do you hear what I hear?" And Joseph rolling his eyes and replying, "Again? Ugh, joy to the world." So what exactly are we celebrating at Christmas? It seems like all the good stuff Jesus didn't happen until much later. And this may be why lots of Christians don't celebrate Christmas, including the Quakers, the Seventh-day Adventists. So I'm just saying, if you wonder why we're making such a big deal about all of this, you're not the only one. In fact, 2 of the Gospels skip Christmas completely. Mark and John don't even begin their biographies of Jesus until 30 years after Jesus was born, when the real action begins. Because the stuff grown-up Jesus said and did changed the world. But Mark and John don't seem as interested in an infant. And I get that. Because if I'm being really honest, it's hard for me to get too worked up about most babies. Even if they weren't born 2,000 years ago. I know that when everyone shows off their newborn, we're supposed to coo excitedly and ask about its sex and how much it weighs, and as if any of that matters. Who cares? It's your standard issue baby. They all look basically the same. Now, someday, they may become someone interesting, but for now, they're just shriveled and needy. But it's all different when it's your baby. Fun fact, I've posted on Instagram exactly once. It was the day my granddaughter was born, and I was so excited I wanted to share it with everybody. Because when a baby's born, the world explodes with new possibilities and new mysteries. Who is this little person? What will they be like? In those first days and weeks, parents exegete every grunt and wiggle for clues. Is he an introvert or an extrovert? A lover or a fighter? Will she be a poet, a plumber, a professor? Who is this child? But there are 2 questions that most parents ask repeatedly, but silently. Will this child like me? Most of us struggle to like ourselves very much. And we're afraid that this new baby we suddenly love so fiercely may not love us back once they get to know us. Most of us have known the sting of rejection. Will this precious little person eventually grow tired of me too? During the long, sleepless nights of infancy, that question plagues many parents. The other question we don't ask out loud because it sounds too selfish, but we often wonder and worry about, is how will this child take my life in unexpected directions? As a parent 11 times over, I can assure you that each child will take your life in unexpected directions. So it makes sense. The new parents wonder obsessively, who is this child? But for most of us, the answer doesn't actually matter because we're going to love them no matter what. You know who the answer does matter for? Joseph, in the story we just read. One day, his fiancée shows up, pregnant, and you know he's asking, what child is this? Whose child is this? What am I supposed to do here? This is truly an unexpected direction because we've never slept together. You can imagine all of the questions and suspicions swirling like a hurricane in Joseph's head. Joseph didn't know who this child was or whose, but he was sure it wasn't his. So you can imagine how betrayed or embarrassed he must have felt. We could imagine him shouting or storming out or worse. Because in that society, women were often executed for such things. But we read, Joseph was a righteous man and did not want to disgrace Mary publicly. So he decided to break the engagement quietly. Despite all he was feeling, he didn't want her to be shamed by society or stoned by the authorities. Joseph was surprisingly kind, but he had a lot of questions and almost canceled Christmas before the story even got started because he couldn't imagine who this child was. And I suspect that today, even if we buy presents and sing carols and wear ugly sweaters and eat too much and generally go through the motions of Christmas, a lot of us miss the true richness of Christmas for much the same reason. We're not quite sure what we're supposed to be celebrating. Now, this sermon is going to be uncharacteristically short. Merry Christmas! That's my gift to you. But I want to make sure that you know what we're celebrating here, because it's not really about a baby. However, Matthew and Luke start their stories about Jesus here for a reason. Because all the things that Jesus is famous for, miracles, sermons, death, and resurrection, only matter and all depend on the answer to the question Joseph was asking that night. Who is this child? And here's why. Because if Jesus is just some guy who speculated about what God might be like, and eventually was executed because the religious leaders didn't agree, and the military thought he was a troublemaker, then we're making too big a deal about Easter as well. And the parables and the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus generally. He'd still be an intriguing teacher, like, Aristotle or Nietzsche. But that's about it. There's no reason to take any of his ideas more seriously than those of the Dalai Lama or Deepak Chopra. And the cross? It's an interesting but ultimately inconsequential piece of ancient history, like the execution of Socrates. We don't throw parties to commemorate that every year because in the end, it doesn't really matter. I've got my own problems to worry about, so I'm not wasting any tears on him after all these years. So why is Jesus so fundamentally different than all those other famous teachers? And why is the cross so essential that we still talk about it constantly, even 2,000 years later, and put crosses on necklaces and tattoos? Because what happened on that cross truly was good news that brings great joy to all people, like the angels promised. On the cross, God was not just changing history, he was changing eternity. He was repairing the relationship between God and humanity that had been broken and distant ever since Adam and Eve. God was saving us from ourselves, our selfishness, our sin, our shame. God was defeating death so that we can live with him forever. And this is what makes the cross fundamentally unlike every other religion, philosophy, or self-help guide. God wasn't simply forgiving sin as if it had never happened. We might welcome that when we're the ones doing the sinning, but those of us who've suffered because of somebody else's sin would find it demeaning to simply pretend it all away, as if our pain doesn't matter. Just let it go and stop making such a big deal about it. But some of us bear scars, literal or metaphorical, that we can't simply pretend away. They still hurt. There's something in us that demands justice. Even young children get outraged when things aren't fair, when their suffering is simply dismissed. They insist it be acknowledged and that the scales get balanced by making the perpetrator suffer at least as much as they did. So we long for justice, and we're terrified of it because too often we are the perpetrators. If true justice were enacted, secretly know that we deserve to suffer because of ways we've caused suffering for others, including God. We long to experience intimacy, but we intuit that our relationship with God or others will never be fully restored until justice is restored. And yet the cost of justice is too steep to pay. So humans from every culture, century, and ethnicity naturally long for justice and are terrified of it. This is the essential dilemma that every religion and philosophy is responding to, and yet all of them fall short in various ways. They seem unsatisfying and inadequate. People kept reaching for an answer, and God kept promising an answer, but no solution seemed sufficient until God did something unimaginable. God decided that He would experience everything we endure, not just our human limitations, but the worst of what humans can do to each other: betrayal, abandonment, abuse, ridicule, racism, rage, rejection, slander, and murder. But God was doing more than simply suffering alongside us. God had come to take the blame for every human sin and shortcoming, every evil, every insult, every wound. God would take the blame for all of it, everything we've ever done or that's been done to us. And then God chose to suffer to settle the score. God paid the price required for justice. And by doing so, God made it possible for us to forgive each other without having to pretend we forget. God made it possible for us to be reunited with Him and with one another without needing to be perfect. God made it possible for us to genuinely love our enemies, and for sinners like us to be embraced as saints at the very same time. And that's what God did on that cross. That's why we get necklaces and tattoos and share this good news all over the world. God did something Easter weekend that can change everything for all of us. But this isn't Easter weekend. So why am I bringing all this up on Christmas Eve? Here's why. And pay attention to this, because this is what pulls it all together. Who was on that cross depends entirely on who was in that crib. Hear that? Who was on that cross depends entirely on who was in that crib. If Jesus was just a brilliant teacher or super nice guy, his death wouldn't be any big deal. And all those stories about rising again would be discarded as little more than wishful thinking and myth. He'd be just another in a long line of self-proclaimed prophets who've been executed by those in power to preserve the status quo. Same as it ever was. And when you die, you'll stay dead forever. Nothing we can do about that. Hopeless as it ever was. In fact, if Jesus was as smart and kind as everyone claims, but simply human, then he'd only make things worse by highlighting what I should be, but I'm not. Like an obnoxious sibling who gets straight A's only makes your report card look even worse by comparison. Or maybe Jesus proves the futility of even trying to be good. I mean, all it gets you is persecution and punishment. If Jesus is just another guy, there is no good news. But if that's God doing and saying all these things, then everything is different. If that's God telling us what God is really like, then it's not like the clever speculations of other religious teachers. If that's God loving tax collectors and sinners who didn't seem to deserve it, then maybe God could really love me, even when I don't seem to deserve it. If that's God hanging on a cross, taking the blame for every evil I've done or that's been done to me, then maybe I really could forgive and be forgiven. If that's God defeating death, well, then I have nothing left to fear. If that's God in the manger, choosing to take on human flesh in order to take on humanity's guilt, if that's God being born in the little town of Bethlehem, in a barn, choosing to experience the things that God should be exempt from, pain, poverty, vulnerability, loss, all because God so loves the world, so loves me and you and our enemies, that he chooses to suffer in order to save us. If that's God in those swaddling cloths, that really is good news of great joy for all the people, if that's God. It all comes down to who was in that crib. It all comes down to the question that Joseph was asking desperately after hearing about his fiance's pregnancy. Who is this child? Who is this child? As he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David, the angel said, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. You are to name him Jesus, which means God saves. And he will be called Emmanuel, which means God is with us. God, who had every reason to reject us, avoid us, abandon us, that God chose to be with us, chose to become one of us, chose to forgive us so that we could be intimate again, be together forever. Church, the reason we celebrate Christmas so lavishly is that it's what makes everything else Jesus did and said matter. It's what assures us that we matter so much that God was even willing to suffer in order to save us. That's why we sing songs and drink eggnog and eat cookies and give gifts each Christmas, because we want to celebrate the night that God did something that no one ever expected, that no one ever imagined. God did more than just come to us at Christmas. God became one of us at Christmas. Heaven and earth, God and humanity, which had been separated since Eden, finally reunited in the very body of that baby. So, yes, it's a birthday party. Yes, it's about a baby, but it's so much bigger than that. It's not about the presents under the tree. It's about the presence of God with me and with you. It's about good news that brings great joy for all people. Christmas reminds us that God is here. God's everywhere I go, even when I feel desperately alone. God came to us at Christmas, which allows us to have hope, joy, peace, and freedom from fear. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Who would ever have expected that? Who is this child? He's the one who changed everything and saves us all. And that is worth celebrating. So, Merry Christmas, my friends.